Hello everyone and welcome back to Conquest Conundrums, the series where I show you guys how to use different aspects of the Conquest Reforged mod. In today's episode, I'm going to be showing you guys how to do basic foliage palettes. So this is only going to be kind of an introductory video, it's going to basically introduce the basics, and I'm also going to show you guys a very basic palette example that you can use in your builds. So without further ado, let's get into it. So how do you actually get started with foliage palettes? Well, the simple answer is to just start playing with the mod. Look at the Conquest Reforged mod's inventory panel for the grasses and shrubs and just have a little play with the different options that are available. There's loads of different shrubs, bushes, grass types, ferns, bracken, nettles, loads of different types of foliage that you can just kind of have a play around with, combine, and just find what works. Another good source of inspiration for this is to look at Google Images. If you have a biome in mind, say it might be a Mediterranean biome or a tundra or a moorland, Google Image, have a look for examples, have a look for real life examples of geography and use those for inspiration. I'm sure that while Conquest Reforged doesn't have every single foliage and type of plant under the sun, you can find plants that represent certain ones that you might not be able to get, or you might even be able to get examples of the plants that you find. It's all about kind of playing around and testing. Furthermore, there are also various websites you can use to help. So one website that I love using is the National Trust website. Now that's obviously UK based, so that might be quite limiting if you want to do say Mediterranean palettes. However, they have a lot of good general knowledge surrounding say trees and foliage that is really useful. Another website I found that's more internationally friendly is Architectural Plants. Now, this is a business that basically sells people plants and does gardening and stuff. However, they have a really good section on their website where you can look at different plants and trees, sort them by kind of climate or biome or area of the world, and really look at the kind of details of those plants in particular based on like soil type and loads of different cool categories, so that you can get really good information on plants. You can also just Google search and find cool resources online. However, those are a good couple kind of starting points depending on what you want to do. Okay, so what about some actual hands-on examples? Well, what I've done here is I've put together 4 different categories of foliage with some example blocks for you guys to kind of use as inspiration and build upon for your foliage palettes. So we have 4 different categories here. We have basic grass, light shrubs, heavy shrubs, and ferns. So without further ado, I'm going to walk you guys through these. So first up we have a basic grass palette. This consists of 3 different blocks. We have common meadow grass, grass, and tall grass. Now these all have a cohesive colour, so they work really well together, and they also have lots of height variation, with the common meadow grass being the smallest and the tall grass obviously being the tallest and the largest. It's worth mentioning here that you don't have to use 3 variants. You can keep it fairly short depending on the context of the build, or you can use taller blocks if you want it to look more overgrown. It's really up to you. Again, that's the nature of foliage palettes. They're very fluid. You can really kind of mix it up and make it however you need for your build, and also depending on the area as well. As I mentioned earlier, you can use Google Images and different websites for inspiration, so you can really use those to provide a basis of what you need. It's also worth mentioning that within the grasses and shrubs tab, the inventory in the mod, there are loads of different other options for grass. You have things like sea arrow grass and Kentucky bluegrass, and these different options have loads of different colours to them, so you can really get cool different colours and shapes and looks depending on what you need. Okay, so moving on, we have light shrubs. So light shrubs kind of provide the next step up from basic grass or basic grass palettes and so on. They really help kind of build up more beyond using just tall grass. So say if you don't want to have such high foliage, you can use things like the lingonberry bush, the bilberry bush, and the beautyberry bush to really kind of bolster and make foliage appear thicker and more diverse. It's also worth noting here that I've turned random tick speed off, because certain bushes do grow certain berries over a certain amount of time, which can change the block state and overall look of those bushes. So if you want to avoid that, make sure to turn that game rule to 0, or else you will end up with loads of berries all over your bushes, and unless you want that, it will look really strange. A good thing to note with these bushes especially is they have quite a neutral colour. They work really well with lots of other different foliage. Not only do they vary in height and kind of size, they also vary slightly in colour. So the first two here have a very similar colour, whereas the last one has kind of a slightly darker green, but it's close enough to where it works. Moving on, we have some heavier shrubs. So for these, we have the wild shrub and the Hawthorne Bush. Now these are my two favourite blocks for foliage in my opinion. They're really useful for kind of covering up areas where you don't quite know what to build, or if you want to have kind of thick but easy shrubs without making them look too, too busy, so to speak, where you're using lots of different blocks to make a simple hedge. You can just use these two, the colours work well together and they work really well to kind of create the look that you might want. It's also worth noting that the Hawthorne Bush is actually a block, so whereas a lot of other foliage options actually kind of sit on a layer if you're using layered terrain, the Hawthorne Bush won't, so you need to basically take that into account if you're going to use them. Now in Chakov we encounter this issue a lot, so what I tend to do is I tend to dig down to the block layer underneath the layer. I'll replace that with a bottom block, so it might be a simple mud palette, I don't know, or maybe rooted dirt or moss, and then I can use those and then surround them with the wild shrub. I might also transition the heavy shrubs such as these into grass using things like nettles or wild nettles. Again, going back to the inventory, we have loads of options here, so you can use things like, again, the nettles, wild nettles, or even ferns, bracken, etc. to kind of transition these blocks. But nettles, especially if you're doing medieval builds, I mean I'm biased obviously, but nettles and stuff are really useful for that. Okay, so moving on, we have ferns. Now, ferns are interesting because you might not always want to use these in an open setting. I mean, you can. It really depends on what you're trying to recreate. However, I've got 3 really cool options here that you can use for builds and stuff. So yeah, we have the Fern 1, the Fern 2, and the large Fern 1. It's worth noting that in the 1.15.2 update of Conquest Reforged, they added a bunch of new fern options. So on top of things like the thick fern, the large fern, and the basic fern, they added loads of these new fern options at the bottom here. So you can really mix and match. You know, going on from that, we also have other options like this, which look vastly different to your traditional fern. And again, these are just really cool blocks. I really like them. The colors are cool. There's a lot of color variation within them. The heights are all different. And because they have randomized block states for models, a lot of the time they might be offset on a block, or they might have a slightly different model, so they look really cool. These are really useful for like a forest setting, however you might want to mix them in with foliage or in shaded areas or whatever's really useful. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a different kind of palette to use potentially if you want to use that kind of thing. In terms of other palettes, it's worth mentioning that I plan to do more videos on palettes and foliage palettes in particular. I plan to go through kind of different biomes and give you guys example palettes that you can use in your builds, because I think that'd be really useful, and also it's really fun going through the Conquest Reforged inventory and kind of pairing up different foliage blocks. Anyways, I hope you found this tutorial useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!